Right. So, this is a talk basically on how we approach mental wellness. And so we've talked in the past about how when you have unresolved stuff, as understood as issues with attachment and trauma. Attachment is being like when there's inadequate nurturing as a child, and trauma being understood as when bad things happen. When you have both of these things over time, you get what we call complex trauma. And so stuff leads to, with time, leads to emotional dysfunction, because time does not heal all wounds. Time merely creates an opportunity for healing or scarring. So when nothing is actively done, it will lead to emotional dysfunction over time. And this is the stage at which, if you've had a lot of trauma, you will deal with PTSD symptoms, diagnoses rather, panic, OCD, avoidance. If there's a lot of attachment issues, this will oftentimes lead to more diagnoses around eating disorder, anxiety, depression, etc. So that's just a little bit of a nuance. Nonetheless, without a lot of addressing, so again, time passes, and this all happens long before you meet them, these people, and maladaptive coping. And I'll just kind of make a correction here. Well, let's call eating disorders, let's group it over here. So maladaptive coping, also something is I prefer to refer to as self-defeating habits form. And this is usually where more significant disorders evolve, like addiction, eating disorders, again some OCD things, etc. Because we all have to cope somehow with the emotional dysfunction. And so this is a simplified way of understanding mental wellness. Collectively, stuff leads plus time leads to emotional dysfunction, plus time leads to patterns of maladaptive coping. And so having understood that, in the next part of this that I want to just touch on is how can this be understood in a different way? And I like to use bar graphs. So let's draw a couple of these little bar graphs here. So these bar graphs, I'm going to collectively refer to stuff as something easily understood as pain. So we'll go for P for pain. Pain is the collective result of all of that stuff that's there. But pain by itself does not mean much by itself. You always have to look at pain relative to the amount of resources that a person has on hand. And as long as the resources are adequate or close to adequate to managing the pain, this person will have similar symptom profile as this person. Not too much pain, but not too many resources, because it's about the relative difference. This gap, let's use the word gap, is suffering. So let's call these, mild suffering. So what else could this look like? Well, if you have someone with a lot of pain and very few resources, well, this is a huge gap. Big gap. This usually means that there's issues with attachment and trauma. Issues with attachment, as you can imagine, lead to situations that are high risk for trauma, such as when someone doesn't have a family that will advocate for them, they're more likely to be preyed upon by predators, for example. And so oftentimes these patients are collectively called, when there's such a big gap, that term personality disorder is used, which simply means, in my world, complex trauma. Why do I prefer that? Because it's less fatalistic. We can do something about that, but it's a long road. Building all these resources, making up for the big gap, is a long road. Now, going back to resources, there's actually different kinds of resources. So if I were to draw a little bit of a little barrier here and color the top, let's use yellow. Yellow is a nice color. And we'll use orange for the bottom. So yellow or orange we'll call internal resources, and yellow we'll call external So there's two kinds of resources, right? So when you are in a situation where you're supported by your friends and family, then that counts as external resources. One can look at external resources as processing capacity, extrafrontal cortex, to help you make sense of things, help grieve with you when you lose things. All of those things constitute external resources. So, for example, family, friends. Internal resources, this is things like meditation, prayer, journaling, exercise, etc. Things that you can do to help you that don't depend on others. And so most people have a combination of internal and external resources that sum up their capacity to deal with the pain. So let's go a bit forward with this. So we're going to continue drawing that graph, and we're going to look at a couple of scenarios here. So when someone comes to you and they have some symptom from some mixture of this stuff, this is what they're going to come to you looking at. They're going to come to you looking like this. They're going to come to you looking like pain. They're going to say, "Doc, help me." And so all of your assessment is really just related to understanding this. This sort of, how much pain is there? Good way to sort of ascertain that is symptom scores, in addition to your history and physical, which won't really tell you how much pain. It'll tell you how much suffering is there, because that's what patients will report. Patients won't report the pain because, that requires awareness of resources minus pain. So the goal is to get an idea of how much suffering is there and how much external resources there and internal resources there. That's the goal of your assessment. So, for example, I would use, you could use the ACE score to assess. The ACE score, the Adverse Childhood Event Score, is really helpful at assessing attachment and kind of bad stuff. If the score is high, like, 2 or 3 or more, or if there's sexual things or domestic violence where child witnesses parent being beaten, for example, or if there's severe mother issues where mother has a hate on for the patient, you can surmise that the pain is very great, irrespective of how they look like. So that's just an example. So I like to use ACEs scores before I work with anybody to just get an assessment. High ACEs score ACE equals long road. Okay, which means I go slow. Even if someone comes to me, "Yeah, doc, I'm ready to work on all my trauma," I'm kind of like, let's go slow. because that's our job, is to turn on the brakes for folks. Otherwise they will get into things that they are not ready for, and they'll either just not come to you, or they'll blame you, or it'll just be drama. So I like to get an assessment of that, and then I like to assess internal and external resources. So internal resources, these are ways that they connect themselves. And external resources connecting to others. And so wherever they're at, the universal truth is when your resources, your sum total of resources, when that's less than your pain, if that's less than your pain, trauma processing can't happen. Why? Because you're simply asking someone to go after a big tiger without any preparation. The chances of winning are pretty much zero. And so people are going to be afraid, they're going to fight, they're going to flight, or they're going to freeze. And what you need them to do is fight with the pain. We use that lightly. We want them to accept the pain and demonstrate and develop some self-compassion. But they're not going to be able to face, that might be the better word, face the pain. And so you get block processing. They'll either freeze, they'll numb out. People will either freeze. We call this dissociation, in which case there's no trauma going on, sort of processing going on, or they will flee. So the goal of us working with them is really to create this scenario whereby people's pain is exceeded by their resources. And when this happens, naturally the resources will begin to digest or digests P. And they'll do that in lots of ways. They'll do that naturally through their, like they'll find a priest or something, or if they're religious, and then they'll start talking about their stuff. They'll do this slowly but surely if they can manage that. And so our job really, depending on where they're at, if they're over here, our job is to bolster the resources so they can get to here. Now, you got to remember, these bar graphs are fluctuating up and down at any given time. So if I were to fast forward over here, the truth is, depending on the time of day, depending on if they've had an argument with, a spouse or something, there's actually, let's call them fluctuation margins throughout a day, throughout a year, throughout a month, right? If you have a friend, but they're not picking up the phone, your resources go down. And so you can get scenarios whereby people are doing well on one day, right? On one day they're kind of like this. But on so they have a loss, and they go to something like this, right? This is simply a way to just understand suffering. And one of the things I always encourage people to do, and a big goal of mine, is to cultivate as many internal resources as possible, because internal resources don't fluctuate. I would much rather have a patient in this scenario whereby they are having internal resource and external resource ratio like that. Because external ratios, that's more likely to fluctuate. Internal is a lot less likely. So you can well imagine what would happen if someone, had a ratio kind of like this. You can imagine that on a good day, a good time in their life, they're going to be maybe looking pretty good. But they're more likely to fluctuate because the nature of life is impermanence. So but the nice thing about external resources, they're easily made. They're easier to make for a lot of people. So a good example of external resource for an addict to alcohol would be like AA, refuge, recovery, smart recovery. And I always say that the lucky ones are the alcoholics, because they have like 500 meetings a week in Calgary. It's a large community. Whereas if you're depressed and lonely, it's really tough to meet people. So, but nonetheless, a good place to start with people is to talk about connecting to others and connecting to themselves. So the last thing I'll kind of say is that, let's say you're in a situation whereby you are optimizing. Someone comes to you in this situation, and despite all your efforts, this is as good as it gets for them. Just remember, that's not that you can't help them, but when it comes to helping them with their pain, then the therapist has to make up the rest. And can. A family doctor has a good rapport. People oftentimes will feel like, even if no one's there for them, their family doctor is. If they have confidence in you, you can be there with them as they're facing off the tiger, and because you're there, they can successfully sort of start dealing with it. And this is one of the reasons why I talk a lot about how the importance of you working on you is, if you can get someone to a pretty equal state in terms of pain and resources, then it can go pretty smooth, right? When you're like you put them way over the top. So even in these cases, it's better to focus on developing internal, external resources and then deal with the pain. And we'll get to how to do that. You can use various kinds of trauma therapies. Protocols, let's call them. But the point here is that getting the resources elevated can actually help remove the symptoms. Most people, when the resources are really high, their symptoms evaporate. And at that point, they have an option to do the work or not. And so our job is to really help them, carry them along, and support them. The last thought that just kind of comes to my mind is that one should be cautious around forcing anybody into any particular trauma work. So it's very safe to understand pain, cultivate resources, and just keep that in mind, that it's their choice if they want to deal with things or not. And we can just do motivational interviewing. But whenever I see a patient, a lot of what I'm doing when I'm sort of assessing them is assessing this, how much pain is there, what are their resources, what type are they, how much do they fluctuate, what are the causes of that, is there like an anniversary of something bad happening, then it's going to be like that. You can prepare people. So this is a simple yet sophisticated analogy to kind of understand some of these deeper concepts. So I appreciate you listening and tuning in to this lecture, and I will hopefully have some more for you in time. Thank you. And again, please forgive me if I misspoke or if I misrepresented, and you can always just email me a question. Thanks so much. Bye now.